name is Jackson Bird, and today is National Coming Out Day. If you want to learn more about the history of the holiday and get some advice on coming out or how to react when someone comes out to you, you can watch the video I made last year for part of my Queer Story series. But today, I want to make a video specifically for anyone who just came out today. If someone came out to you, share this video with them. And if you came out today, welcome to the family! This is your introductory video to Out and Proud Queer Life. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know, so listen closely. So now that you are a part of the LGBTQIA+ community, you may start noticing certain superpowers that our cis heteronormative pals don't possess. Chiefly among them, the ability to rattle off really long initialisms with grace. LGBTQIA+ what? And don't be alarmed if your vocabulary suddenly includes an increase in puns. Queerly beloved, we are gathered here to gay. They make more queer puns, but I can never keep a straight face. This is just your standard level everyday power, keeping you in tip-top fighting shape for when you gotta go into battle, in which case you'll be able to use your new superpower, witty clapbacks at haters. It's super effective. You've also now been endowed with a complete knowledge of the astrological zodiac, an unironic appreciation of rainbows, and the superhuman ability to totally own alternative lifestyle haircuts. Now on to some housekeeping notes. Be sure to download the GayOS 2.1 software update to recalibrate your gaydar for optimum safety, solidarity, and cutie perusal. By now, you should have received a copy of the Gay Agenda in the mail. And be careful when you open the package, as it is filled with glitter. So don't worry about it too much. Now that you're out, you will constantly be finding glitter in your house, on your clothes, on your skin, without any recollection of how it got there. Also included in the package is a rainbow flask, some pastel hair dye, a box set of Steven Universe Blu-rays, a Tegan and Sarah album, this petition for Wonder Woman to be openly buying the next film, and a copy of the documentary Paris is Burning. Because if you're going to be voguing at queer nightclubs now, you best know who created voguing, and it wasn't Madonna. You'll also receive a list of all of the homophobic and transphobic legislators in your local area, along with their addresses, phone numbers, and some suggested talking points for every time you have to call them. Hi, yeah, my name is...
Insert your first name.
I'm a constituent of...
Insert your district.
And I'm calling to urge you to vote against...
Insert latest dick bag move Congress is making.
What? Wait! There's more! Also in your Queer Starter Kit, you'll find 5 pieces of poster board and some glitter pins for making protest signs. A coupon for 15% off all organic body soaps at your nearest local feminist co-op. A bedazzler, some extra glitter, and a jean jacket complete with pronoun buttons. Oh, and if you're trans, don't worry. You'll be getting the transgender expansion pack in the mail soon. It includes such fun additions as noise-canceling headphones, so you don't hear misgendering and verbal harassment. A power-up bonus for calling even more legislators to remind them that you exist. And a Marauders Map smartphone app download for finding trans-friendly bathrooms anywhere you go. It even includes features like a birth certificate with the gender you identify as, so you can get into those tough-to-access bathrooms. And a realistic fart noise maker for covering up those unwanted sounds like the opening of sanitary napkins. And if all else fails, your expansion pack also includes this reusable titanium bottle, which you can pee in at your own convenience anywhere. Who even needs bathrooms? Stay safe, kids. Alright, all joking aside, I have put a list of real resources down in the description box for you to turn to when the homophobia and transphobia of the world gets to be too much, or if you find yourself in need of shelter, legal protection, or other basic necessities. So,
I'm going to stop this here because I would like to waste no more time in introducing our speaker for today. Let me get our other slide up here. Hi everyone, I'm Laura Gonzalez. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I teach anthropology here at Miramar College. San Diego Miramar College's LGBTQ+ Alliance, the Diversity and International Education Committee, along with Professional Development, are thrilled to present a talk today by the incredible Jackson Bird. Jackson Bird is an internet creator and activist working to demystify the transgender experience by sharing his and others' stories online. You can hear some of those stories on his podcast, Transmission, as well as on his YouTube channel, Jack is Not a Bird. A TED resident and speaker, Jackson's TED Talk, How to Talk and Listen to Transgender People, has been viewed over 1 million times. Jackson was also a 2018 GLAAD Rising Star Digital Innovator, a YouTube Next Up creator, a Logo TV Social Trailblazer nominee, hailed by MTV as a social media warrior who helped restore our faith in 2016, and has been repeatedly called extraordinary by actor Eddie Redmayne. He is not only engaging and kind, but extremely insightful and articulate, educating people on things we never knew that we never knew. He is positively a shining light. Please join me in welcoming to Miramar College, Jackson Bird.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you for having me out here today. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. And that video was a little bit, more 201 level, so if there were a lot of words or jokes that you didn't get, hopefully by the end of this you'll understand it a little bit better. Before I get started, I am just curious, raise of hands, how many of you have met a transgender person before? Oh wow, nice. Okay, keep your hands up, keep them up if you've met more than one trans person. Okay, and now keep your hands up if you know a trans person, like you have friends, family member, coworker, yourself. All right, not bad, this is pretty good. So one more thing, raise your hand if you could confidently define the word transgender. I'm not gonna call on you and make anyone do it, but hypothetically, raise your hand if you think you could do that. Okay, awesome. A little bit, yeah, I'm there too, kind of, I think. Okay, so overall, only 16% of people in the United States say that they know or work with a trans person. That number rises to 21% on the West Coast, so well done. It also increases for millennials and younger generations, so good on everyone here. But I secretly believe that number is even higher. I think that people have met more trans people than they think that they have, because we don't all go around introducing ourselves as transgender with a handshake, even those of us who do go around making speeches and YouTube videos about it. I still like to keep it to myself sometimes, unless someone really needs to know, because people don't need to know where I was born or that I'm lactose intolerant or how many people I've dated until that information needs to come up. None of us should have to disclose personal details as soon as we meet someone. That's how I feel, at least. Not all trans people feel the same way. Some trans people want you to know that they're transgender, and some people don't have the privilege of being read as anything other than transgender. People can tell as soon as they see them. If you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person. We will have some experiences in common, but we are all so different in ways related to our identity, like how it affects us, how we relate to it, how people in our lives respond to our identity. And we're different in so many more ways not related to our trans identity. So meeting one trans person or reading one trans person's story online doesn't mean you know much more about every trans person's experiences. You just know that one trans person's experiences. Now, the further problem with the if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person thing is like those stats I gave you a minute ago, most people have barely met one trans person. You guys are doing pretty good on that front, though. But at least, people haven't sat down and had a deep, meaningful conversation with a trans person. I can't tell you how many people I've gotten into those conversations with who reveal to me that I'm actually the first trans person they've gotten to have a deep talk with. They've met trans people in passing, they've maybe tried to educate themselves, but they haven't really gotten to hear it from the horse's mouth. Here's the thing that bugs me about all of this. What bugs me the most about being transgender is how awkward it is. Not because the gender I was assigned at birth mismatches the one that I really am. That's whatever. That's life. What bothers me, what's awkward about it, is how awkward other people can get when they're around me. And that awkwardness is caused by unfamiliarity. People not being used to being around trans people. People not knowing what to say, how to address us, how to treat us. So I am on a mission to help the world get more comfortable around trans people and the idea of trans people. I firmly believe that the more stories you hear from different trans people, the more you start to realize how diverse and nuanced we all are. But also, the more you might begin to realize just how much we have in common with you. I mean, we are all human, after all, so we do have far more in common than not. So I work on spreading these stories through my YouTube channel, like you saw, as well as through my podcast Transmission, where I sit down with a fellow trans person each episode and let them tell their story on their own terms. And this all is a pretty selfish mission, honestly. I'm just kind of tired of being treated like an awkward customer, and like the nerd that I am trying to teach the awkwardness out of people. But I'm also doing it for other transgender and gender nonconforming people out there, because I remember what it was like growing up and having no words to describe what I was feeling. I mean, from my earliest memories, I felt like I should have been being raised a boy. But I didn't have any trans people in my life to see as an example that there was anyone else like me out there in the world, anyone else who felt like I did. I didn't see any trans men on TV or in the movies. I was growing up in Texas in the 90s and early 2000s, so like my school teachers never even uttered the word gay, let alone transgender. So if me being open and sharing mine and other trans people's stories helps young trans people see themselves reflected back in the media and get the resources that they need that I didn't have, then it's worth it. But at the same time, in spreading some of this knowledge to non-transgender people, it's also making the world a little bit safer for those young trans kids. Because the more that people are familiar with trans concepts, the more people there are out there ready and willing to accept them. I mean, mostly, kind of. Visibility is a double-edged sword. For every trans person who is figuring out who they are thanks to the increase of trans people in the media, there is someone else using that information to hurt us. We trans people used to slide under the radar a lot more than we do now. For example, it's not just that some trans people got emboldened to use the bathroom of the gender they identify with a couple years ago, causing the big stink of anti-trans bathroom bills. Like, we didn't all just collectively decide we finally had to pee. It's just that more media representation meant that people finally realized we'd been in those bathrooms the whole time. And more importantly, since marriage equality had passed in the Supreme Court, anti-LGBTQ+ people needed a new scapegoat. Now that they know more about our needs, they know how to take away our access to them. But those kinds of people, the kind who think that I should have to present a copy of my birth certificate before I'm allowed in one bathroom or another, they're not really the people I'm trying to reach in my work. I mean, maybe one day, and like, sure, if some of those folks stumble across my podcast and use it to expand their minds instead of add to their strategy books on how to enact violence against trans people, that would be awesome. But I'm not holding my breath. Instead, I'm specifically focused on people who want to learn. You know, people who support trans people, but maybe don't know exactly how to talk about us or to us, who get nervous about messing up so they don't even try. People whose hearts are in the right place. Now, I know some of you are just here with your class, maybe just to earn some extra credit. Maybe you showed up trying to impress someone you want to go with on a date, but I'm hoping that if you did show up today, it's because you're one of those people. Someone who wants to learn a little bit more about how to be more supportive. And I also apologize if some of you in here already know quite a bit more than I'm implying you do. Maybe you already know all of this stuff, but bear with me while I cover some basics, because I like to think that you can learn from any experience, no matter what it is. In fact, I remember the very first assignment that I ever had in college. It was from my first year seminar professor, Dr. Eric Selbin, and he included a little note at the bottom of the assignment that said, everyone in class would be coming from different backgrounds with different life experiences, and we should remember that we all learn in different ways and at different speeds. That was one of the first life lessons that Dr. Eric Selbin would teach me over my college years, but I think it might have been the most important one, because it can be so easy once you know something to think that everyone else knows it, especially when it comes to social justice stuff. But we've got to remember that we didn't all come out of the womb knowing the definitions of intersectionality and bystander intervention, neither of which I'm actually going to define today. Last year, I got to see best-selling author Anand Giridharadas Haridas give a talk about democracy, and he said something to that effect that really stuck with me. So Anand said, as wokeness has percolated from Black resistance into the cultural mainstream, it seems at times to have become the test you must pass to engage with the enlightened, not a gospel that the enlightened aspire to spread. Either you buy our whole program, use all the right terms, and expertly check your privilege, or you're irredeemable. But, Anand asks, is there space among the woke for the still waking? Is there space among the woke for the still waking? I think about that a lot, because I was definitely a little late coming around all the terms and concepts in the LGBTQ+ world, and I am still always learning, as I think we all should be. But I try to hold really close to me how difficult it was for me to grasp some of these concepts at first, so that I don't ever just assume someone else knows them already or judge them too harshly for not understanding at first. You know, sometimes you have to learn something 6 or 7 times and really sit with it for a while before it sticks.
A great example of this was when I first learned that the words sex and gender are not synonyms. Gender reveal parties might lead you to believe otherwise. Most people who have gender reveal parties just say gender because it sounds more polite than sex. You know, I mean, can you imagine like their powder pink and baby blue like cakes and banners just reading sex reveal party? Like sounds like something that might happen in a red light district. I mean, it's silly to think about, but it turns out gender is not just a more polite term for sex. So back when I was a sophomore at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas, a fellow sophomore on the newspaper staff wrote a absolutely terrible article about why the women's studies department was pointless. Yeah, yikes. He claimed it was satire, which I do believe was his intent because he wasn't a mean-spirited guy, but dude also had no idea what satire was, or what the women's studies department was for that matter. And the school was a very feminist, activist-heavy student body, so naturally they were up in arms. And within a few days, they had gotten the writer to appear on the campus radio to talk to some of the brightest folks in the women's studies department. They were relatively civil towards him, and he was eager to learn and listen. It was a much more civil conversation than I could ever imagine happening nowadays, unfortunately. And after a while, the women's studies department majors diagnosed his main problem, a misunderstanding of the difference between sex and gender. Now, listening from my on-campus apartment as I worked on my statistics homework, I remember scoffing at the radio. There isn't a difference between sex and gender, they're synonyms. But I kept listening, and soon I was opening tab after tab on my browser, stats homework abandoned, trying to comprehend the discussion they were having on the radio. I needed to see simple, clear definitions of these apparently different terms. With the help of Wikipedia, it was starting to make sense, but I wasn't quite there yet. I could tell I'd finally been shown most of the pieces of the puzzle, but I needed to figure out how they fit together. And for a few weeks thereafter, I kid you not, I spent several hours just sitting alone in the dark in my dorm room, just thinking about it, trying to parse it out. It really took me a while, so we're gonna dive into this because I just know for me, it took a while to really grasp it. What I eventually figured out, in the simplest terms, sex is what you're assigned at birth, based on apparent physical characteristics. Gender is your innate sense of being, basically. It gets a lot more complicated than that, and there's some disagreement on the usefulness of the word sex at all, but that's kind of the basic thing. When we like to think that only one of two things happen when a baby is born. The doctor looks at the newborn's apparent anatomy and shouts, "It's a boy." Or the doctor looks at the newborn's apparent anatomy and shouts, "It's a girl." But in 0.5% of births in the United States, a doctor looks at the newborn's not so apparent anatomy and shouts, "It's a, actually we're not sure." See, roughly 1 in 2,000 people in the United States are intersex, meaning that their sex organs or their chromosomes in some way fall out of the typical binary of male and female. There's dozens of different intersex conditions. It sometimes means that someone has XXY chromosomes or YO chromosomes. Being intersex is distinct from being transgender. We're still talking about sex right now, not gender just yet. So transgender is about your innate sense of being. Intersex is about physical characteristics. Not all intersex conditions are known right away at birth, and there's far more intersex people out there than we're led to believe, partly because when it comes to chromosomal disorders, most people don't get their chromosomes checked until there's a medical reason to do so. And because when babies are born with ambiguous sexual anatomy, doctors often operate right away to make the baby look normal. They choose a gender and tell the parents to raise the baby as that gender, on occasion not even getting the parents' consent before they operate. This is a huge issue, and if you are curious to learn more about it, because that's about all I'll say on the matter, if you're curious to learn more and take action, I do recommend looking up the Intersex Justice Project. They've been doing some amazing work lately. Intersex Justice Project. But the reason that I'm bringing up intersex conditions and risk confusing you a little bit is to make the point that even sex is not as black and white as we've always been taught. Sex itself is a spectrum, just like gender. There's a lot more of a gray area in there than we were always led to believe. So let's talk about gender. Gender is, once again, that innate sense of being. It's how you feel in your head and your heart. Gender is how you express yourself. It's how you behave. Most importantly, it's how you self-identify. For most of the world's population, your gender identity is the same as the sex you were assigned at birth when the doctor or the midwife shouted, "It's a boy" or "It's a girl." That is your gender assignment. Your gender assignment is what other people give to you. Your gender identity is what you give to yourself based on that innate sense of self. There's several other components to gender as well, besides just the assignment and the identity. There's also gender roles. So gender roles, what you're expected to do. You know, girls play with dolls, boys play with trucks. Women stay at home, men go to work. Gender roles have changed throughout time and across cultures, like how women in the United States didn't really start working in male-dominated fields until about World War I. Or up until the early 20th century, pink was actually the most masculine color, and blue was for baby girls. Or you can think about how now increasingly men are stay-at-home dads. Gender roles are always evolving, and people break them every day, regardless of their gender identity or their sexuality. Now, there's also gender expression. This is how you dress yourself, how you do your hair, the way you talk, the way you move your hands, like I do a lot when I give talks for some reason. Maybe it's how you walk, like for example, women, or some women could maybe walk with a stiffer gait. Or maybe some men have long hair. And like gender roles, whether you go against societal norms of gender expression or not has no bearing on your gender identity or your sexuality. Yes, there can be a lot of correlations. I'm sure we can all think of some stereotypical correlations, but there's not necessarily any causation. Now finally, one more component of gender. There's gender attribution. So this is the gender other people attribute to you based on their interpretation of all of the above and their own experiences with and views of the world. So that could mean when the doctor or midwife shouted, "It's a girl," when you were born. But it could also mean the people you encounter every day in your life. When we see people, we automatically sort them into all kinds of different buckets. Tall, short, male, female, Asian, Latino, visibly disabled, redhead, good-looking, swipe left. That's what I do in my head now, thanks Tinder. It's just what we're wired to do as humans, which a lot of apps realize. But you can wire yourself to start thinking about those buckets differently, or at least more expansively. Okay, so a little quick recap. We've got gender assignment. That's what you were assigned when you were born. That one can also be called your sex assignment, because remember, sex is based on those physical attributes. Then there's gender identity, how you personally feel. Being trans means that those two are different, that your gender identity is different than your gender assignment. Then there's also your gender roles, what you're expected to do based on your gender. Gender expression, how you present yourself and behave. And your gender attribution, how other people perceive your gender. So let's play around with these. Let's try to throw them all together. Let's say that there's someone who was assigned female at birth and also identifies as a woman. But she often goes against gender roles by, let's say, working in a typically male-dominated field like construction. And I don't know, maybe she's also a bit aggressive, a trait associated with masculinity. Her gender expression is also kind of masculine. You know, maybe she dresses practically for her work in construction and has a short haircut, which means that sometimes strangers on the street might attribute her gender as male. None of those things make her a man, though, because she identifies as a woman. Let me throw another one at you. This one's a little bit more complex. Let's say there's someone who was assigned female at birth, but identifies as a man. Maybe he was raised as a girl, which means that he still sometimes enjoys taking on some female gender roles, like he enjoys sewing or baking. But his expression is very masculine. He has short hair, a beard, he wears suits most days. Strangers on the street sometimes attribute his gender as a man, sometimes as a woman, they're not really sure. But he's always a man because that's how he identifies. So you can imagine why it took me so long, like sitting in my college dorm room all alone to parse out these differences between sex and gender. There's a lot to it, and they're all very nuanced and dependent on so many other factors and contexts. When people say things like, gender is a social construct, you might hear this sometimes, people saying stuff about that, and that's true. Gender is a social construct. A lot of the examples I was giving are things that we as society have decided are men's things or women's things. But just because something is a social construct doesn't mean that it doesn't have real implications on our lives. Government, organized religion, marriage, those are all social constructs as well, and I think we can all agree that they play very real roles in our lives, and that when you try to go against someone else's idea of how they should work, you face real consequences. Now, I suppose I was a little bit more concerned with this whole mystery of gender and its implications than other people might have been, because back when I was in college, I was really confused about my own gender. I didn't come out as transgender until I was 25. So back at this point in college, I was just totally lost. Now, I mentioned earlier that I always felt like I should have been assigned male at birth from my earliest memories, and how I didn't have any idea that transgender men like me existed. That was a little bit of a lie, though. By age 12, I did actually know that female-to-male transgender people existed. Sort of. So one day after school, in middle school, while both of my parents were still at work, I happened on an Oprah special about transgender kids, most of whom were trans boys. They were kids who looked just like me. They had begged their parents for short haircuts. They ran around the house with their shirts off. They wore button-ups instead of ruffled dresses on picture day. At the very end of the episode, about the time I started keeping my finger on the return button on the remote in case my parents came home, Oprah asked one of the older trans boys if he liked girls. He turned red and said shyly that yes, he liked girls. And I remember feeling like a rock just dropped down into the pit of my stomach because I didn't like girls like that. Or at least I was pretty sure I didn't. I definitely didn't want to like girls. As a 12-year-old erstwhile girl in Texas, I had been raised on a pretty hefty dose of homophobia. So the mere idea of liking girls terrified me. And it was fairly easy to ignore any interest I might have had since I also happened to like boys. I'm bisexual, by the way, but I did not understand that back then or know that that was an option, so it really tripped me up when I was trying to figure out this trans thing. Because I wasn't able to conceptualize of the idea that transgender people, like all people, can be any sexuality. Oprah was telling me that trans boys like girls. That was therefore the only option because Oprah said it, so that must mean that I was not a trans boy. I must have been something else entirely. And then not long after that, I went to see Adam Sandler's movie 50 First Dates. Yeah, oh, it's a really great movie, just not problematic at all. So there was a character in 50 First Dates credited as Jennifer, played by a man, who was flamboyantly gay and introduced as a man who had had gender reassignment surgery from female to male. And it was very clear from the lilt in his voice and his limp wrist, the implication was he had made a mistake. It was that classic case of the phrase that was always like casually sprinkled into so many sitcoms in the 90s, oh, sex changes, they never work out. I remember watching the brief scenes with this character with terrified fascination. So I was thinking to myself, like, okay, he's being lampooned as having made a mistake in changing his gender, so either A, he isn't actually transgender because he's gay, and as Oprah told me, being both isn't possible, or B, he is both gay and transgender, but that's such a rare anomaly that people are highly disturbed by it. I had been shown someone like me, a queer transgender man, for the first time ever in the media. And the lesson I was being taught was that either I didn't actually exist or I was a total freak. Now, I know that this was a shock value comedy, not an educational film. I shouldn't have been taking so many strong cues from it, but I didn't have anything else. I mean, not to mention the fact that an Adam Sandler movie was going to tell me a heck of a lot more about how people actually feel about trans people than a sappy Oprah special on little kids. Now, my experience is not uncommon. Countless trans men talk of having known about transgender women growing up, but never realizing that it could, like, go the other way, so to speak. You know, we all grew up idolizing androgynous gender benders like David Bowie and Dr. Frankenfurter and Eddie Izzard. And even though the subversion we were seeing might have given us goosebumps, it wasn't quite right. Some of the more lucky transmasculine people were introduced to butch lesbian culture and got to experiment with masculine hairstyles, clothing, and roles, but they too often suffered from the misconceptions of society around transmasculinity. It used to be a really common narrative in lesbian circles that trans men were just confused butches who were betraying women by transitioning. And this stigma kept a lot of trans men closeted and dysphoric for decades, and it still exists in some circles today. So I continued through high school and early college with all these cultural misconceptions looming over me. On occasion, I would refer to my big dark secret to my closest friends, like I really wanted to tell someone, but I barely had the words for what I felt, and I was genuinely scared that divulging my secret would lead me to be locked up in a mental institution. So I kept my feelings to myself and just suffered in confused silence until one evening, towards the end of my freshman year of college, when the expedition to uncovering my gender identity got an unexpected kickstart. A classmate had posted a Facebook status announcing her intention to begin living as a woman. Starting the very next day, she would be wearing women's clothes to class, using female pronouns, and asking people to call her Lily. I was floored. You could do that? Without any surgeries or anything, you just tell people that you're living as another gender? At the time, I had never heard of such a thing. And based on my familiarity with the work of Eddie Izzard and David Bowie and my own brushes with gender exploration, I thought I had a handle on trans concepts and terminology. I was totally wrong. I did a quick scan of Wikipedia to reassure myself that I knew enough to defend her if anyone tried to discriminate against her on campus, but turns out I had been laboring under some far-flung delusions about the correct meaning of different trans terms. So let's go over a few of those now. First off, transgender. So going back to all the different components of gender that we were talking about, being trans means that your gender identity does not match what you were assigned at birth. It's that simple. I mean, of course it's not. That's why I'm here giving a 40-minute talk about it. But if you need one simple line to kind of work with and keep with you as you think about it, that's it. Being transgender means that your gender identity doesn't match the one you were assigned at birth. So that can mean a lot of things, and the exact definition of it and the term itself has changed a lot over the decades, but right now, transgender is the most broad and accepted term to use. Now, by contrast, there's cisgender, C-I-S, cisgender. That's what you're called if your gender identity does match what you were assigned at birth. Cis comes from the Latin for on the same side, just as trans comes from the Latin for across. So calling someone cisgender is not forcing a label on anyone any more than saying someone has brown hair or green eyes is forcing a label on them. It's just another helpful way to categorize people into those buckets without always saying non-transgender, which is essentially what it means. But if you say non-transgender, kind of reinforces the idea that you have normal and you have transgender. It's like an othering happening. So cisgender is what most people in the world are called. That means that your gender does match what you were assigned at birth. Another thing that can trip people up sometimes is trans man versus trans woman. So a trans man is someone that was assigned female at birth, but is a man. A trans woman is someone that was assigned male at birth, but is a woman. So you're never using the gender that they were assigned at birth to describe them. It's always the one they currently identify as. But there are also people who don't identify as men or women. Some people identify as both, or neither, or somewhere on the spectrum in between the two. They might use words like non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, bigender. If they're Native American, they might use the term two-spirit. There's all sorts of different gender labels that they might use to identify themselves as. And some of them might consider themselves under that trans umbrella, some of them might not. And if you think back on all the different components of gender that we were talking about and how they all interplay, you can start to get a sense of how and why some people might identify as something beyond the typical man and woman boxes. And a quick note on gender fluidity like this, playing with expression and identity has existed throughout time and across cultures. I see a lot of critics these days acting like preteens on Tumblr invented non-binary genders in 2013 or something. But the first non-binary person that I met was my 55-year-old professor in college. It just seems like expansive gender identities are new because they've gotten a lot more media attention lately. And more media attention causes more people to realize that, hey, that's how I identify too. And terminology has changed a lot over the generations. And as terminology changes, so does how people conceive of themselves. Because yes, trans people have existed throughout history. But they didn't always call themselves trans. Transgender didn't become the accepted term as we currently use it until about the 80s. But even its predecessors of transsexual and transvestite, those weren't really around until the 1930s, with a slump in usage until it reemerged again in the 50s because the leading expert of sexual studies, Dr. Hirschfeld, his institute was burned down by the Nazis. So that kind of puts our gender studies work back for a couple of decades. It took a while for it all come back together again. But the point is, no matter what we call ourselves or how exactly we performed our gender at different times, trans people of all stripes have always existed. Now, how we perform our gender, what we choose to do as a part of transitioning, that still varies a lot depending on the person. So remember my classmate Lily, the Facebook status she posted coming out as trans. She told us that going forward, she would be dressing as a woman, using female pronouns, and going by the name Lily. Now, at the time, I was shocked because I, like so many people, thought that transition for a trans person meant just one thing: the surgery. Now listen, if there was one magical surgery that could turn me into a tall, muscular, like Adonis of a man overnight, I would sign up in a heartbeat. But it's not that simple. There's dozens of different gender affirmation surgeries, from chest surgeries to bottom surgeries, facial feminization, and man sculpting, which apparently is a trademarked procedure I recently learned. Many trans people will only ever undergo one surgery, if that. Maybe because they don't personally feel the need to, which is very important, but mostly because these procedures are expensive and health insurance is only starting to cover them. In fact, the first step for a trans person seeking physical transition is to start with hormone replacement therapy. So this means taking estrogen for trans women or trans feminine people and testosterone for trans men or trans masculine people. And these hormones basically kickstart a second puberty, giving you all those secondary sex characteristics that you got as teenagers. So hormones, specifically testosterone, gave me a deeper voice, a bit of facial hair, about 15 more pounds of muscle without working out at all over one summer. That was fun. But transition isn't just physical. All those things that Lily said that she was doing, dressing differently, using she and her pronouns, using a new name, the act of coming out itself, that's all social transitioning. It's adjusting that gender expression to match the gender that you identify as and perhaps that you want people to attribute to you. Now, no part of transition, none of the things that I just said are required to be trans enough. And remember that gender roles and expression don't define an identity. Like if a trans woman chooses to dress kind of masculine, she's still a woman. If a trans man decides to paint his fingernails, he's still a man. Because like, would dressing as a tomboy make a cisgender woman not a woman? Or would painting his nails make a cisgender man not a man? Of course not. It's just the same for trans people. On that note about transitioning, you might think that your trans friend maybe needs to adopt a certain look, behave a certain way, or have a certain medical procedure before it's time to switch the name and pronouns that you use to refer to them. There's actually no distinct point in transition, physical or social, at which you're supposed to start using a trans person's new name and pronouns. As soon as they tell you their new name and pronouns, that is when you start referring to them by that name and pronouns. And if you ever encounter someone you're not sure what pronouns they use, it's totally okay to just politely ask. Don't ask by being like, yeah, what gender are you or something? Just be like, hey, what are your pronouns? Or you can maybe even start by saying, hi, my pronouns are he, him, what pronouns do you use? That's kind of a polite, less awkward way of asking them about it. And I know it can be difficult to make the change. Like if you knew someone beforehand and they switched pronouns, you're probably gonna slip up here and there. I do it myself far more than I would like to admit with other trans people. If it does happen, just correct yourself and move on. Don't apologize over and over again. Don't make a big deal out of it. Just act like it was a normal slip of the tongue that could happen with any other word. And then if you get the chance later on, apologize to them privately. Like specifically, say you're sorry for misgendering them, assure them that you'll try harder in the future if that's true, and don't make the apology all about you and how guilty you feel. The reason this is important is because, well, I mean, first, it's awkward, you know, when you apologize so much. Like, have you ever had a friend who did something like kind of annoying, but then they made such a big deal out of apologizing over and over again that you actually got annoyed with them? It is just like that. But also, when you make a big deal about it, especially if you're out in public or around other people, you risk outing that person to people who might not have known that they're trans. And maybe some of those people aren't as accepting of trans people. So you could have just put your friend in some very real danger. It is always a trans person's right to disclose their status on their terms. You should never be telling anyone else that they're trans without their permission. And while we're on this sort of preachy note, I think I'll wrap up with a few ways to be a good ally to trans people. The most important thing is to take the time to educate yourself, which, hey, by attending this talk, you've all done a little of, so good job, good on all of you, but keep it going. You know, there's so many resources available online that can answer just about any question that you have, so look to those first before asking the trans people in your life to be your teacher. Like, trans advocacy and education is my job, so it's okay for people to ask me a bunch of questions about it. But even then, like, since it is my job, I don't always want to be asked. Like, if you have a friend who works at the Apple store and you're at a party together, Yeah, they'll probably answer your question about like why your iPhone keeps freezing when you try to connect to Wi-Fi, but like you can tell they'd really rather you didn't bug them at this party. Or worse, maybe you like interrupted them while they were in the middle of flirting with someone, which has happened to me. I was at a party once and things were going pretty good with this girl. We were having a great conversation. And then this dude came up and had to tell me about his friend who just came out as transgender and asked me how he could be a better ally. And I was like, dude, read the room. And that wasn't the worst part. 2 other people did that night. 2 other people. I have my arm around this girl like I am clearly not interested in educating you right now. But by contrast, one time I was talking to my friend Tom, who is cisgender, and I casually mentioned something about using a urinal. And he was like, wait, how did... And then he stopped himself and said, never mind, I can Google it later. I appreciated the heck out of that. Like, okay, sure, I could have explained it to him, I probably would have, but that would have led to a much more intimate discussion than Tom and I usually have. And he recognized that. He took his own initiative to use the ample resources online, learn on his own time, and he didn't make things awkward for either of us. So be more like Tom. Use Google for answers, not your trans friends. And as an ally, as you're learning, you gotta be okay with messing up. Like make peace with the fact that it's gonna happen and use it as a learning opportunity. I know there can be a lot to familiarize yourself with, a lot of terms. I just threw a bunch of them at you. You might mess up, but your tone and intentions will go a long way. Like someone who is clearly acting out of compassion and respect, showing that they're trying to learn, but maybe says the wrong thing, that's so much better than someone who isn't even trying. And like I've been saying, every trans person is different. What I've shared today is just my story and the most commonly accepted terms and facts right now, but that doesn't mean it will hold true for every trans person you meet forever. So approach them with open ears and open hearts. And remember that ally is an active word. You should always be listening and learning how to help, how to do better. Like, did the Allied forces in World War I just look to the nation suffering and say, hey, we support you, good luck? No. They joined in the fight. So do the same. Use your privilege as a cisgender person to speak up in our defense when we can't. And you know one way that you can help out today? Go vote. Ideally for candidates who will defend the rights of transgender people and not try to define us out of existence. And I know, I mean, some of you might have voted this morning, and I know you have early voting. Raise your hand if you voted today or earlier. Amazing. Oh, it was much better turnout than last night. I love it. You guys are great. I think I lost the last page of my speech. But most of it was telling you to go vote. Honestly, if you've not voted yet, so in California, you don't have to be registered to vote. You do, but you can register on Election Day. So you can go to your polling place, register there. Also, California State requires your employer to give you 2 hours paid time off to go vote. You probably should have told them before today, and you definitely need evidence that you were voting, but you can do that if you need to. There are so many resources online to find out where to vote, what you're voting on. You can even order pizza in the voting line. There are apps for that, and Lyft is giving free rides to the polls today. So there's really no excuse not to vote. Even if you are disillusioned with voting, there are so many people in our nation who cannot vote. So even if you don't want to vote for yourself, maybe go vote in their honor, because there are a lot of us whose lives really do depend on it. So that is a great first step as an ally. But the number one most important thing that I just want you to take away is to remember to treat trans people with the same respect and dignity that you would anybody else. You know, just cut the awkwardness and be chill about it. Thank you. Any questions for you? Okay, great. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. So feel free, I know there's some holes in some of the stuff I covered, so if you got questions on any trans things, questions on me or my work, or some voting resources I'd be happy to share. Yes, right there. Do you want the microphone for, or?
Would you like to speak in the mic?
I'm good. Cool.
Okay. If you could just repeat the question,
Yes.
or I can do it.
Oh yeah, because we're recording, so I'll repeat your question.
Okay, great.
So to continue your analogy, if we are allies to trans people, where's the battleground and how is this battle fought?
Wow, that is a great question. So the question was continuing my war analogy. If people are to be allies to trans people, where is the battleground and how is it fought? In lots of places. There's so much work to be done. In most states in the United States, trans people can still be fired from their jobs for being trans, can be denied housing for being trans, aren't protected by any type of hate crime, discrimination protection. Recently, some of the biggest news was the Department of Health and Human Services has decided that gender identity should not be included under Title VII and Title IX protections, so that's like in schools, in athletics, and in the workplace. And also, trans people are murdered at like, I don't know, 3 or 4 to 1 rate compared to cisgender people. Suicide rate is about 40%, much more likely to fall into drugs and sex work and not have access to housing. So there's a million things to do. So, you know, pick your poison, whichever way you want to get involved. The best way to start with is just listening to transgender people. So like when I say go out there and find resources online, there's a lot of resources. You might find some bad ones. So my recommendation is to try to see like if an article you're reading or a video you're watching was actually made by a trans person. It's much more likely to be accurate. I would also recommend some great resources are the National Center for Trans Equality, especially if you're looking to join the battle. They've got a lot of advocacy recommendations and different ways you can take action. GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, has some great like 101 resources. They specifically focus on the media. So they do a lot of work with like presenting style guides to journalists about what the most up-to-date language is to use. Yeah, I think following organizations like the National Center for Trans Equality, Lambda Legal, even the Trevor Project, they don't specifically focus on trans issues, they're LGBTQ plus broadly. But following any of them on social media or looking up their websites, they'll have a lot of ways for you to get engaged on any of those myriad of issues that the trans community is facing. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Cool, thanks. Yes?
Should I get the mic?
You can repeat the question.
So I'm wondering, throughout all the LGBTQ people, who do you think is the most invisible right now and is not getting enough representation?
I mean, if we just want to stick to LGBTQ, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and then queer or questioning is what the Q is. Bisexual, maybe? They're usually the most invisible. Trans people historically, but we're really having a media moment right now. I think trans people are still the most misunderstood because there is so much of educating that has to happen. But yeah, bisexual people, the problem is like we can get treated poorly both within and without the community. Outside of the community, a lot of people be like, bisexuality, like you just want to have a lot of sex, like you should just choose one. There's all kinds of things like that. And then within the community, people often act like, oh, well, I thought I was bi and then I realized I'm gay. Like it's a stepping stone thing. And the other thing that happens is like, you know, let's say you are a woman who's bisexual and you end up in a long-term relationship with a man. You're not visibly seen as bisexual, and some people think that you're not bisexual anymore. So there's just like so many things that can lead to invisibility for bisexual people. So I guess that one. But I would also say, if you want to expand it to LGBTQIA2+, so including intersex people, asexual people, they're not very visible even compared with bisexual and trans people. So yeah, and the white and the gray.
So, how do you know when it's safe to use your preferred bathrooms?
So the question was, when is it safe to use your preferred bathrooms? Yeah, so one thing I didn't say in this talk that I said in my TED Talk is a secret about bathrooms and trans people is we are way more scared to be in there than anyone is of us, I'm pretty sure. Like it is such a nerve-wracking place, and if you are transitioning in any way where your physical appearance is going to start looking from one binary to the other, it can be really hard to determine when is the right time to use the other bathroom. And it's a very personal thing. Most people I know and myself, it was just when we started getting weird looks in one bathroom. So once I was, like when I was in women's bathrooms and women would like come in and get scared of me and be like, oh shoot, am I in the wrong, you know, like that kind of thing, then I was like, okay, I guess it's time to start using the men's room, which, you know, sucks because they smell a lot worse. So yeah, I mean, I think you measure the reactions of other people, and there's a great app called Refuge Restrooms, that is a crowdsourced app that tells you where gender-neutral restrooms are. So you could like log on here, and if someone's put it in yet, you would see the all-gender restroom out there, and it'll even tell you like if you have to buy something to access that restroom, if it's handicap accessible, all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of cool resources out there for that. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering, do you have any advice on like starting to explain trans issues for someone who doesn't even have a baseline? Like I was trying to explain recent political policy to my father, and he said, "Oh, like a guy in a dress." Like, where do you even start?
Yeah, it's tough. I think if you're able to have like public figures or characters, like there's more and more of those happening, although I can't think of a good one. I'm just thinking of like when I came out to my dad, it was literally in the middle of Caitlyn Jenner's like she had come out, but we didn't know her name. She hadn't done the big like cover thing yet, but he still was able to be like, oh, like Caitlyn Jenner, I mean saying her old name. But like he had a reference point where I think if I had come out to him a year before that, he wouldn't have even had that reference point. And yeah, it's still a lot of like not correct assumptions, not correct language. I think that's one thing. When you're starting with someone who has had that little exposure to it, don't get upset if they are using incorrect terms. Don't feel like you need to give them all of the information. It is like starting with stepping stones. So you can, maybe try explaining like, well, a guy in a dress might be someone who's wearing a costume, but transgender people are people who this is who they really are. It's not a costume. Breaking it down. See, I mean, I tend to take the approach of like, let me just tell you how sex and gender are nothing we've ever been taught, and they're just wibbly wobbly messes, because I think it's good to expand everyone's ideas of gender, but sometimes you do need to just get those basic building blocks. That is a tough one, and one that I encounter a lot, but I don't think I do a good enough job of breaking it down. I think of my dad a lot for that. And I think it's just because he has a trans kid that he gets it, even though he doesn't totally get me, and he still votes for people who want to take away my rights. But, he's seen a couple of trans people, so he gets it more than the guy in a dress thing, I think. So I don't know, exposure. That wasn't super helpful. If I think of more, I'll find you after. Yes?
So there's a lot of college-age people coming out as trans now, a lot of trans people actively in college.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of practices are most important for colleges to pursue to be more inviting and accepting of trans people?
Excellent question. The question was, how can colleges be more inviting, accepting of trans people, because there are so many more college-age trans people out there now. I think a great thing is getting some trans sensitivity inclusion training for all staff and faculty, because it's one thing for students to have put forward policies around gender-neutral housing options, gender-neutral bathrooms, making sure professors are using the name that a trans student has told them and the pronouns they've told them, not just the ones that are on the roll. So these are all base-level things that a college should be doing, and most of them at least say they do now. But the next step is actually making sure that every person in a position of authority on campus actually knows what that all means, because policy doesn't really matter unless the people at the front desk understand that policy and are still going to respect it, right? So definitely investing in some of that inclusion training. But yeah, the dorms, the bathrooms, making sure professors are aware, and also listing all these resources on the website where trans students can find it, so that they don't have to just message YouTubers in their Instagram DMs, how do I tell my professor that I want this name? They can actually look on their school website and be like, oh, I should email them ahead of time. Or here is the LGBT advisor who can go with me to the office hours and talk to them, or something like that. And then also make clear what things the health insurance and the health center will cover for trans students, because that's a big one as well. Some schools, like private universities with giant endowments, have the health centers actually cover hormones in the student health insurance. And I know a lot of trans students who decide what school to go to based on that. So yeah, I'm kind of getting off topic. But my number one thing is there's those basic policies, but you just got to train everyone else too. Yeah, great question. Any other? Oh, I see. Yeah.
So, as a cis person, how do I make sure I'm speaking with trans voices instead of for them or instead of them?
That was an awesome question. The question is, as a cis person, how can you make sure that you're speaking with trans voices instead of them? So, yeah, I was going to address this more, so I'm glad that you brought it up, because I said at the end, that you should use your cisgender privilege to speak up for us when we can't. And that's an important caveat, when we can't. So when like let's say when the thing from the Department of Health and Human Services came out. You as a cisgender person might have had a couple of things to say about it, but a great thing would be to retweet people, like both literally and figuratively, like retweet trans people's things that they're saying about it, share articles that trans people have written, and make sure you read all the, educate yourself on what all the trans people are saying. The number one thing is to amplify their voices, speak up when it's kind of appropriate, but don't ever, when a trans person can be putting in their input instead, use your platform and your privilege just to amplify what they're saying more so than saying stuff on your own. And if you are doing your due diligence of really listening to trans people online and in your life and in your life and stuff, you're probably fine. You're probably aware of all that you should be doing. Yeah.
So how do you deal with dysphoria? Just generally.
Yeah, that's a huge question. The question was, how do you deal with dysphoria? And this is one word I didn't define. I might have said it once or twice, but dysphoria is it's feeling discomfort in the mismatch of your gender identity and your gender assignment and maybe different parts of your body or how people treat you and their gender attribution. And actually in the DSM-5, 6? I don't know, from the American Psychological Association, the actual diagnosis for trans people is gender dysphoria. So that's what dysphoria is. And it's tough. I think that I tend to say that whatever things that you have that help with your mental health and self-care on any other thing can be really helpful if you're having an especially dysphoric day. Finding a support network of fellow trans people, whether that's a campus community group, a community center at large, or just online, having people that you can kind of vent to who get what you're going through, I found to be very, very important. And if you are able to access any type of mental health counseling, that is also super, super effective. For me, things like writing in my journal or exercising are very helpful. And working with those support groups and with mental health, medical practitioners and stuff to decide if there are social or physical steps that you can take that would alleviate some of the dysphoria on a day-to-day basis, and then doing what you need to do to take that action. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that there is free mental health services and therapy here.
There is free mental health services and therapy here on this campus. That's awesome. And ask John in the jean jacket if you need more info on that. Cool. If there are any more questions, I'll stick around for a little bit right here, but I think we need to wrap up so people can get to class.
So I just wanted to say thank you so much to Jackson for coming all the way out here from the East Coast and speaking to us today. Can we give him another hand, please? I also just wanted to mention, Jackson was talking about community, and we do have community on campus for folks in the LGBTQIA+ communities. So there is a student, faculty, and staff alliance called the LGBTQ+ Alliance. We meet every other Wednesday at 2 o'clock. And also a student club, an associated student club called Club Spectrum. Whose president is sitting right over here, my friend Carlos. And you are welcome. That's those are on the other Wednesdays at 2 o'clock. Please get in touch with me, Laura Gonzalez. I'm in anthropology. You can look me up on the website if you want to find out more. And please come join our community if you would like to. We'd love to have you. So if there are any last maybe questions for Jackson, we've got a few minutes. I know you all need to get to class. We'll shut down the mic and you can come up and talk for a few minutes one-on-one. All right, so thank you again all for coming.